welcome to the Bible class of Jews for Jesus with Bob Mendelsohn.
Exodus chapter 21, the protection of the innocent. Today's study is about law. Laws again. It's probably time to buy a new book about lawyer jokes. The books of the Bible now take a drastic turn from narrative and a great story of Abraham's family in their continual circumstances to a set of legal documents by which most people identify the entire book. Ask most people what the Bible is about, what the Older Testament's about, and they'll tell you, thou shalt this and thou shalt not that, right? Or more likely, a set of laws which they cannot do. Thou shalt not do such and such. Is that what the Bible is really all about? I don't think so. What is the purpose of law anyway? Well, we saw it last week. 3 things from Exodus 20:20. The purpose of Torah. And that was threefold. Number 1, to prove the utter sinfulness of each person in his moral distance from God. That is, how far we are from God. Secondly, to demonstrate humanity's need for a mediator if we were ever to approach God. And 3, to teach people how we should live together in peace and fullness by following such a moral law. That may be a way to view the outline of the Aseret HaDivrot. Commands 1 through 3, the right relations with God. Command 4, right relation in the worship of God. And Command 5 to 10, right relations with others. Okay, so today, after the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, is given, after the crowd has pushed forward to see the marvelous sight of the 2 tablets in Moses' hands, after the hush has again fallen on the teeming masses, now another wave of instruction comes from the deliverer Moses to the newly freed slaves. More teaching, more demands, more boundaries. Today's lesson then relates to various laws on slavery and purchasing, on homicide and bodily injuries, and the beginning of case law on property damage. This may not excite you as much as the narrative of Joseph or Moses and the Pharaoh, but I assure you this is as relevant today as it was then. How shall we live it out, now that we're a freed people, needing to know how to relate to one another? The book of Exodus is about our freedom, long after the initial deliverance took place. How do freed slaves live freely? That's still the story for us, isn't it? We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. That's our family story. But even more, we were slaves to Satan and to sin, to our own selfishness. And God in His own mercy delivered us. God redeemed us and brought us back by the Redeemer of all, Messiah Yeshua. Thanks be to God. Now, as a redeemed person, what do I do? How do I live? Let's read from this chapter. I'm guessing a lot of people skip this chapter when they read the Bible. They're looking at stories, and here's Joseph, and here's Abraham and Sarah. These are great stories. And then we get through all the oxen and goring, and where's that good thing? And they skip this, just like you do when you're reading another novel. John Wesley said of this chapter, the laws recorded in this chapter relate to the 5th and 6th commandments, and though not accommodated to our Constitution, especially in point of servitude, yet they're of great use for the explanation of the moral law and the rules of natural justice. So verses 1 to 11 are various laws about owning people. First things first. You, Israel, are a delivered people. You were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. All you know is slavery. Now, when you fall into hard times and you want to indenture yourselves again, here are some rules to follow. Does that make sense? Sell yourself to become a slave. An Australian who lives in another country will often look for stores where he can buy his Vegemite or find a news broadcast with the cricket or rugby scores. We tend to the familiar. So, slavery, first thing we got to deal with. That's interesting to me. There's a limit on slavery. You can only be a slave to a person for 6 years. How does that sound to you who've worked for the same boss for 20 years? Of course, today's employment situations are very different than the slavery concept, but still there are parallels. Wesley commented, lest they should abuse their servants as they themselves had been abused, provision was made for the mild and gentle usage of servants. C.S. Lewis said this about slavery: mankind is so fallen that no man can be trusted with unchecked power over his fellows. Aristotle said that some people were only fit to be slaves. I don't contradict him, but I reject slavery because I see no men fit to be masters. The New International Version commentary on this section tells us this, quote, I love my master, my wife, and my children. Do you hear that? That's in the verse. If a man says that in verse 5, this has legal rather than romantic overtones. It doesn't mean I love him and I wish I could be his wife, but it means I am compliant with him. I don't hate him.
Duty.
At least duty, but I think it goes beyond duty. I find my master an honorable man, a righteous man, a good man. Yeah. So the judges changed the slave status from temporary to permanent by a ceremony at the doorpost. What do we put on the doorpost? A mezuzah. The mezuzah of the master's house. Actually, the mezuzah is the word for doorpost, not the word for the piece of item that we put on there. The perforation of the ear was a humiliating punishment in the Middle Assyrian laws. Why people don't see this in tattoo parlors or body piercing places. Psalm 40, let's look there, verse number 6, which is in verse 7 in the Hebrew, in case you're looking at it. It's odd how it's off a bit, but you remember the superscript, which we call not part of the text, is part of the text in the Bible. Here's Psalm 40 for the choir director, a Psalm of David. But in the Hebrew, Lam Natseach LaDavid Mizmor, is actually verse 1. So this, which is verse 1, is actually verse 2 when you read it in the Hebrew. So don't be confused. Verse 6, sacrifice and offering you've not desired. My ears you have opened. Hebrew, kara. Burnt offering and sin offering you've not required. Hebrew word kara also means to dig or to bore. Poteach is to open, like Pitchu li sharei tzedek, open to me the gates of righteousness. Psalm 40 says something about you have bored my ear, which is a similar situation. Sacrifice and offering you've not desired, my ears you have opened, but really you have cut or dug. This is what the Master does to me. That's what Psalm 40 is. Listen to what he says, verse 1. I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined to me, heard my cry. He brought me up out of the pit, out of the miry clay, and set my feet on a rock, making my footsteps firm. He put a new song in my mouth, even praise to our God. Many will see and fear and trust in the Lord. This is Ashrei HaGever. Blessed is the man who's made the Lord his trust. So God is my master and I'm his servant. And that's why he has bored or cut or opened or dug my ears. I've given myself to him as a servant forever. That's what it is to be a follower of Messiah, of God, is to have our ears dug. Karita li, you've opened my ears. The situation of the woman sold by her father indicates a marriage setup, not a slavery one. So we're back in Exodus. This even though she is designated a servant by the book. If the new husband breaches his contract with her, she is actually free, inducted for a good ride after the invoking of the forfeiture clauses of the moral law. You've got to know how different this is than anything else in that era of history. Women had no rights, slaves had no rights at all. Here, a Hebrew has 6 years, and then you have an option. A woman who's mistreated has an option. She's now married. She can be liberated, completely liberated. This is unheard of in societies of that day. Let's talk about the word forever. We see that back in the book of Exodus here. Permanently in verse 6. It's forever in other versions of the Bible. He shall serve him permanently. Ba'avado leolam. He shall serve leolam. Some religionists, especially in churches like the Seventh-day Variety or in Orthodox Judaism, cite biblical references to bolster their understanding of mandates that last well beyond our day. For instance, concerning the Sabbath, they quote Exodus 31:17, "It's a sign between me and the children of Israel forever, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, but on the seventh day he ceased from work and was refreshed." So it's a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. And in Deuteronomy 12, concerning Torah itself, Be careful to listen to all these words which I command you, in order that it may be well with you and your sons after you, leolam, forever. 2 Kings 17, verse 37. The statutes and the ordinances and the law and the commandment which he wrote for you, you shall observe to do leolam, forever. Solomon's throne. Remember this in 2 Samuel 7, the prophecy. Your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. Your throne shall be established forever, it says. But there's something wrong. Solomon's throne is not here. Some quote passages about Israel lasting forever, but a clear view of history will tell us that Israel did not last forever. For 1900 years it did not exist as a governance. The problem with this simplistic approach is found here in verse 6 of Odo Leolam. Is this forever in the Greek sense of the word forever? Or does it more correctly mean as long as he lives, or until the year of Jubilee? In eternity, a slave will not be perpetually serving his earthly master. There is an end to forever. So the guy who gets his ear pierced and works for Mr. Goldberg is not going to be in heaven with his ears pierced and serving Mr. Goldberg. Does that make sense? There is an end to the idea of Leolam. It means to end at an appointed time. It doesn't mean eternally in a Greek sense. Otherwise, this Israel prophecy doesn't make sense, and this boring of the ear makes no sense. At the year of Jubilee, everybody gets liberated. Everybody. A few years ago, General Richard B. Myers, the U.S. chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was commenting on Iraq and the U.S. presence there back in the days of Saddam Hussein. He said, "The situation has to change. It cannot go on forever." Did he mean that the war might still be being fought in my children's old age, or was it just an expression for longevity? That's the way I see it. I might startle you, but it has to end or these verses don't make sense. Those who argue for the perpetuity of Torah are not reading their own books, where when Messiah comes, Torah will change. According to the rabbis, when Messiah comes, Torah will be changed. It won't be the same as before. So how can Torah be forever in the non-ending sense? We who know Messiah personally, the one who was born in Bethlehem and died for our sins on the cross, know the law changed at his coming. For instance, about 2,000 years ago, a big building fell over in Jerusalem, the temple. And as a result, hundreds of biblical laws that are forever came to an end. The sacrifices were forever, but they stopped. How is that? Because everything, Leolam, is not forever in a Greek sense. We just can't think Greek. The law which was Leolam forever came to an end. It came to its conclusion and changed. We could not perform heaps of mitzvot. Forever came to an end. There is, however, no end to eternal life. No end to eternal walking with God. No end to God who is himself eternal. And as a result, for all who trust him and know Yeshua, we too will live eternally. That's good news, friends. So you just have to read things in their context before we blanket say, oh, here's the word forever, therefore in 2014 we ought to be doing this. Whatever it is, you just have to read it in context. Our sister is quoting from Jeremiah 31, 35, and 36, clearly indicates that God will be forever in touch with, not dust and rocks in the land of Israel. Listen to what it says. Thus says the Lord, who gives the sun for light by day, and the fixed order of the moon and the stars for light by night, who stirs up the sea so that its waves roar. The Lord of hosts is his name. If this fixed order departs from before me, declares the Lord, then the offspring of Israel will also cease from being a nation before me forever. So what's in view? People, the offspring of Israel. In other words, when Jews, think about it, in Russia, under Soviet domination for 70 years, not only Russia, but Ukraine and all the republics, if Lenin and Stalin and Khrushchev had had their way, there'd be no Jews. But there were Jews. And we survived. If in France, after the revolution, Jews were rising up to too much position, or in Germany, when Jews were not allowed to have station and were not allowed to have law degrees or medical degrees and such, if they could have, they would have obliterated us. But God preserved the people of Israel, not the dust and rocks of Israel. And you've got to keep those separate, or else anytime somebody says anything against Israel, the dust and rocks, you think they're anti-Semitic. But if they say something about Jewish people, then we know there's trouble. You hear the difference? Israel the people, Israel the nation. It's hard because nation also means people. Was Israel a nation in the year 400? When you hear the word nation, you're thinking a geopolitical unit. When you hear the word Spain or Uzbekistan, what do you think? You think of a geographical region. But when you think of Chinese, not China, but Chinese, what do you think? You think of the restaurant across the street. You think of the people in Tamworth. You think of the people in Argentina. But you don't think necessarily in a country, a geographical place. So you have to separate Israel, the people, from Israel, the land, or you're going to be frustrated when you read Scripture. The children of Israel, the offspring of Israel, will be as preserved as the sun and moon and stars. That's a comfort to us as Jews, eh? Okay, laws on bodily injuries and homicide, verses 12 to 32. A little unusual. Verse 24 uses the oft-quoted text of an eye for an eye, remember? Again from Wesley, if every man might avenge himself, this would introduce universal confusion. The tradition of the elders seems to have put this corrupt gloss upon it, but magistrates had an eye to this rule in punishing offenders and doing right to those who are injured. That makes sense. It's not, you hurt me, I'm going to retaliate. You remember Gandhi, who said, an eye for an eye only ends up making the whole world blind? I believe, however, that it goes beyond human organizing of the society. Listen to the intentionally first-person statements of the Almighty. Exodus here, verses 13 and 14. What does he say? God will let him fall into his hand, then I will appoint you a place to which he will flee. This is God speaking. God is personally involved in the rescue of someone who's done some damage to someone else. This is pretty great. And look at verse 14. If, however, a man acts presumptuously toward his neighbor so as to kill him craftily or to take him even from my altar. See how involved God is? I think that's fantastic. God doesn't want anyone to miss this. It's about him and his plan when people take others' lives. What you do to others, you're doing to him. He takes it personally. Now, some people have taught that an eye for an eye was overturned by Jesus. Right? You've heard that before in the Sermon on the Mount. Let's look there for a moment. In Matthew chapter 5, Matthew is the first biographer of Yeshua. And in chapter 5, verse 38, Yeshua says this, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, don't resist an evil person. So it sounds like he's contradicting it, doesn't he? You've heard this, but I'm telling you something different. Sounds different. But I say to you, don't resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other cheek also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. Whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks of you, and don't turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. Is he contradicting the law? Not at all. According to Kilgallen and Weber in their book, Beyond the Commandments, Yeshua is elevating the teaching on the Sermon on the Mount way above the teachings of Moses. He didn't say if someone killed, they could be killed. He said if someone's angry, they should be punished. He didn't lower the bar of biblical standards. He raised them. Imagine higher than the elevated standards that Moses gave. Moses said, if you speak badly about your family, that would warrant the death penalty. Yeshua takes it further. The 5 cases which follow in Exodus 21 might involve the death penalty for bodily injury, fighting, slaves who are struck by their masters, pregnant women who are assaulted, an overworked slave, and goring oxen. All are good to know. All are proper for magistrates who are trying to organize the justice system in Israel. Where did the justice system come from in Israel? Who created that? Moses' father-in-law. Jethro in chapter 18 said, this is not good. You're up all day, you're dealing with set up a smaller court system. And now the smaller court system is getting advice from God through Moses on what to do when these types of cases come before you. So it makes sense that they should have this all written down. So when Yeshua says, it's not an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, I'm telling you, when somebody hurts you, don't retaliate. Think about it. If Muhammad Ali strikes me, a big boxer hits me, right, and I turn the other cheek, what am I saying to him? You can't win. I'm still here. I'm not running away, and I'm not picking up an AK-47 to shoot you. I am standing my ground. You cannot intimidate me. But I'm not going to seek justice against you. This is a higher grace than eye for an eye. Do you hear the difference? It doesn't demean eye for an eye. It extends it. It amplifies it. Eye for an eye meant that there should be compensation given to the person in appropriate measure. Yesterday I watched this horrible current affair on TV on Channel 9 about some woman who was in Northern Beaches, I think, several years ago, and was having a bit of a cough, and the bartender gave her a spoonful of something, some kind of relief, for her cough. It turned out to be oven cleaner, and it ate her esophagus and her throat, and as a result she's had 30-some surgeries, and she can't eat. She has a little feeding tube. She looks normal. You wouldn't recognize any problem, but the compensation that should come is an eye for an eye. If her throat was gouged, it should be throat for throat. So does that mean we should gouge the throat of the guy who gave her the oven cleaner even though it was a mistake? Again, Gandhi's comment says, if you did that, the whole world would be throatless and blind. And
people use that scripture to say everything before has gone. So that means that I have license to come into your house and break as much of your stuff as I want. And I don't have to make restitution because I'm under grace. I've had this quoted to me from half a dozen people from this particular...
I would say you should stay away from those half a dozen people and get new friends. These people are both ignorant and going to be compensated by God. Judgment is coming to them. You don't mistreat people in the name of grace. Grace should be amplifying the law, not diminishing it. It should be better than Torah. It should not be less than Torah.
Someone under that grace wouldn't behave like that anyway.
Well, that's right. Especially if you knew what you deserved and how God was gracious to you. You want to turn and extend grace to others. You don't want to treat them badly. How much did we do against God? And yet, think about it. When you say to God, not that we should, not that we ever did, but let's say somebody listening online, and you put your fist up to God and say, God, I hate you. Or God, I don't want to deal with, I don't like you anymore. I'm not going to comply with you. When I was, 18 years old, and I looked up to heaven and yelled at him, I did this, and I turned off the light on Shabbat. I was so mad that God had this law that I couldn't turn off the lights on Shabbat. And I was mad at my Shabbos Goy who didn't come in and turn it off. And I was mad. I was mad at God for making me stare at these bulbs in my dormitory room at the university. And I got up and I turned it off and I cursed him. I cursed God. Now, if God were acting under the eye for an eye, then I should have curse fall on me straight away. Do you see how it works? But God was gracious to me and didn't kill me. I, therefore, ought to turn and be gracious to others. That's how life works. We'll look more closely at this next week, but to suffice the intro to open the doors for us. God looks after all people, especially those who cannot see something on the misuse of the open pit, etc. They call it culpable negligence in legal terms. But as I say, we'll teach from there next week. Let's look a bit more at this Exodus 21 passage tonight. Verse 2 tells me something. If you buy a Hebrew slave, he serves for a certain amount of time. But it doesn't say what do you do if you buy a foreign slave. So this was really an in-house conversation. And I like that. This isn't about all slavery of all time. This is about slavery at that time for these Jewish people. You think, well, why would a person sell himself to be a Hebrew slave? You know, you're a Jewish guy. Just came out of slavery. Who wants to be a slave? Desperation causes you to look for cash some way or another. You've got a wife, you got kids, you want to do this. He says this, right? Doesn't he? I love my master, my wife, and my children, verse 5. So there's this idea that I don't have any other way to pay for my land, or the tax on the land, or the tithe that I'm supposed to bring in.
This is controversial, because I asked a South African this question, and they said they have very little unemployment in their nation because people who can't afford to live like what we're discussing. They are providing services and being paid for them. As au pairs and
domestics,
domestic cleaners and nannies and all of those things. The other people who are employing them are having 12 children at a time. I knew Christians and Jews who were the same, like this.
Okay.
But if they didn't have the problem we have here, because people had work and they were making themselves available to work and all of this, the economy went round and round.
Same in Latin America.
And it's the same in Southeast Asia.
Go to Singapore.
They go to Israel, all over the place.
Aged care workforce in Israel are all Filipinos.
In Moscow, a lot of Uzbek people serving in hotels and domestics and such. Very interesting. If a man, verse 7, sells his daughter as a female slave, wow. Why would you do that? Sell your daughter as a slave. Again, to provide for her, to make sure she's tended, because in the Jewish way of doing things, this is what's being created here, we should treat a slave as a member of the family. You remember last week we read that on the Sabbath day you shall not work, neither you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male nor female servant, nor even the cattle or the stranger who's within your gates. So this idea of slave doesn't mean them, but kind of an us extended. That is mishpacha on steroids, and that's a good thing. Which, by the way, helps me understand why a Shabbos Goy makes no sense.
In Israel, everything has to stop. The Arabs stop, everybody stops. There's no people running around trimming wicks.
Abraham circumcised his slaves as well, didn't he?
Yeah, that's right. They were part of the family. This idea of the Shabbos Goy, I find it odd. A Gentile who does things that you're not allowed to, like turning on lights and turning off lights, and who turns on the lights at the synagogue. But they don't turn on the microphones. You can have lights in the shul, but you can't have a microphone. What the heck? I can't hear you, Rabbi. Talk louder. You've got the lights on.
During Shabbos, if we turn on the light before Shabbos starts, it can be keep lighting till the end of the Shabbos.
Right. And the same with cholent. It's like a stew. It's a very Ashkenaz style of Hamim, the Sephardic one. Same idea. And it's a big slow cook, low cook, keep the heat on all the time. So you're not really turning on the fire to cook on Shabbos. I tell you, where there's a law, there's a lawyer. Where there are two lawyers, there's a loophole. These guys know what to do.
Don't change the condition. If it was lighting, it's keep lighting.
Right.
You just don't break light.
Unless a Sabbath Gentile comes in and turns it off. I mean, it was always so funny. Here came Neil, my Shabbos Goy, and I would say to him, so Neil, I'm getting ready to go to bed. It's a little bright in here, but I couldn't even say that because that would be a hint that he should turn off the lights. You can't mention, but you can allude, but you can... Anyway, there's so many halachas, there's so many rules in relation to what you can say, what you can't say, what you can carry, what you can't carry, inside an Eruv, outside an Eruv. I mean, the whole thing is so clever. And I don't mean to demean the clever system, but there's some seriously flawed ideas of a Shabbos Goy when it says neither you nor your son or daughter, male or female servant. Obviously, the care which we should be extending to the slaves is missing when we hire before the Sabbath, not on a Gentile to do the bidding that we're not allowed to do. It just seems wrong. So just a couple more things. The comment I made last week about honor your mother and your father, is that what it said? It said, honor your father and mother. Yeah. So father is named first.
Yeah.
Why? Because honor is generally naturally given to the mother before. So here it says in verse 15, he who strikes his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. And verse 17, he who curses his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. The natural thing is to curse and strike your father because he's the one disciplining first, generally speaking. Now, do you know anybody who has put their children to death? I mean, like this, surely be put to death. Who's killed their kid because they struck them or cursed them? No, we don't know anyone who's done that. And yet there are people who tell me that they are Torah observant. That they observe Torah, that they keep mitzvahs. But I've never met anyone who had a child who struck or cursed his father or mother who's actually been put to death. Because we all look at that and say, that's out of bounds. We say, that's as far as I want to go. Now this is the legislation. And remember, back in chapter 20, Moses said to the people, don't be afraid. God has come in order to test you, that the fear of Him may remain with you so that you may not sin. So this guillotine is hanging over a Jewish boy. If you curse your parents, you will die, so that you may not sin. So you say, well, that never is going to happen. How do you know? You might be the first one. Or this God has come in order to test you, so that you can see, yipes, that's the standard against which I'm being measured. If I've ever cursed, and I did, I cursed my dad. I never struck him. He was bigger than me for a good lot of years. I got bigger than him towards the end. But I said bad things about my father and about my mother. I should see the smudge on my face and go, Oi Gebolt, look at me, I've sinned. This is the mirror of the Word of God that tells me that I'm a sinner. And now I need to repair that so that I may not sin. So how do we repair it? Calling out to God, forgive me in Yeshua's name. Get the smudge off, live better, honor your parents. That's how it works. This business of the ox, verse 33, if a man opens a pit or digs a pit and doesn't cover it over, an ox or donkey falls in, the owner of the pit makes restitution. That's exactly what the eye for an eye is highlighting. It's the same idea. You do something to that guy, make restitution. There's a justice system that says you owe somebody. That woman with the burned out throat and esophagus needs to be compensated with a lifetime of food, lifetime of health care, lifetime of so much. I can't understand why they're dragging their feet. Well, I can. It's because they don't want to say, if I admit to this, then I'm responsible for that. The same reason we didn't say, I'm sorry to the Aborigines until Kevin Rudd became Prime Minister. We didn't know if there might be compensation required. But the Bible clearly says that the owner shall make restitution. Give money, verse 34, to its owner, and the dead animal becomes his. Basically, he's bought it. So this is the right way to treat people. When you were a slave and you come out of slavery, what do you know but what you've been told? What do you know but that you're beaten, you make bricks, you lie down, you get up, you make bricks, you lie down. You get up, you make bricks, you lie down. I mean, that's all you know. There is no life. And now God is saying, one of the first things, look, love me, honor me, don't take my name in vain, take a day off once a week. Take a day off? Slaves would never have had a day off. How cool is that? Slaves, take a day off, honor your parents, don't kill each other, don't commit adultery, honor God, honor families. So he gives that, and then he says, I tell you what, I'm going to be more specific. If your ox falls into a pit, here's what happens with the ox, here's what happens to the pit, here's what happens to the neighbors. This is good news. Honestly, the law is good, isn't it? Torah is good. It tells people how to get along. So when there are certain people you reference who are antinomian, against the Torah, nomos is Greek for law, who are antinomian, who say, it's law, I don't like it, I don't need it. Well, what do they do with husbands love your wives? That's a law. What do they do with let the elders that rule well be worthy of double honor? That's a law. Well, we don't believe it. But Yeshua said, don't return evil for evil. Well, that's a law. Well, what do they do? I mean, this is ignorance, to be antinomian. Every man, according to the book of Judges, did what was right in his own eyes. And the best way to override that is do what Yeshua wants. Look at verse 35. If one man's ox hurts another's so that it dies. So here's a clear chicken and dog situation. Then they shall sell the live ox, divide its price equally, and they'll divide the dead ox. Or it's better that the ox was previously in the habit of goring. Well, if it is, then its owner has not confined it. He's got to pay ox for ox, and the dead animal becomes his. So it's straight as clear as if your animal has been known to be a ruthless killer, if it's a wolf or a dingo or a dog, and it has bothered people before and killed chickens or killed rabbits or killed children next door, then you got to put it down. And that's it. Life is simple. It's simple when you follow the rules. Now, what does it mean to follow the rules? It means go beyond the rules and understand the principle or the spirit of the law, or as they said in the castle, the vibes of the Constitution. So here it is. Yeshua is going to give us information about this week after week after week. We're going to keep looking at Exodus, starting with chapter 25 in a few weeks. We're going to see the tabernacle being built. The Mishkan is a study in itself, and a great study. We're going to have a great time with that. But these various laws that most people skip are great, by the which we understand how to get along with each other.
You've been listening to the Bible class of Jews for Jesus in Australia. For more information, contact Jews for Jesus, Post Office Box 925, Sydney, Australia 2001. God bless you.